Hello guys, Carley here, and today we're going to be continue reading the Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. I had to pause for a second. Now, I just wanted to let you know that the reason I'm recording this instead of doing it live is because our internet has been crashing a lot, and I don't want the lag for that to affect the reading. And also, there are important links down below, especially a GoFundMe for the system, because we are currently living in at a family cabin, but we are looking for a job, and currently we're running out of food and relying heavily on help from people that we really don't want to rely on, especially because because we're afraid they're going to hold it over our heads, etc., etc. But yeah, we're doing all that I'm not doing anything. It's James who's doing stuff, because me doing interviews, not gonna happen. This is one thing, talking to you guys through a camera. Interviews are terrifying. Anyways, let's get right on to the video. I need to pause real quick though. Alright, back. I just need to get some water. This is iced tea. Not water. Wow, I'm dissociated. This is a great start. Also, I wanted to clarify, it is Carley and Nadia Kokon. Nadia is here because she's a soother and she's trying to help everyone calm down, especially the body, because we've been so stressed and depressed lately. Now, intro's out of the way. We were on Chapter 7. Mudbloods and Murmurs. Harry spent a lot of time over the few next days dodging out of sight whenever he saw Gilderoy Lockhart coming down a corridor. Harder to avoid was Colin Creevey, who seemed to have memorized Harry's schedule. Nothing seemed to give Colin a bigger thrill than saying, "All right, Harry," 6 or 7 times a day, and hear, "Hello, Colin," back, however exasperated Harry sounded when he said it. Hedwig was still angry with Harry about the disastrous card journey, and Ron's wand was still malfunctioning, surpassing itself on Friday morning by shooting out of Ron's hands in charms and hitting tiny old Professor Flitwick squarely between the eyes, creating a large, throbbing green boil where it had struck. So, with one thing and another, Harry was quite glad to reach the weekend. He, Ron, and Hermione were planning to visit Hagrid on Saturday morning. Harry, however, was shaken awake several hours earlier than he would have liked by Oliver Wood, captain of the Gryffindor Quidditch team. "What's the matter?" Harry asked groggily. "Quidditch practice," said Wood. "Come on." Harry squinted at the window. There was a thin mist hanging across the pink and gold sky. Now that he was awake, he couldn't understand how he slept through the racket the birds were making. "Oliver," Harry croaked, "it's the crack of dawn." "Exactly," said Wood. He was a tall and burly 6th year, and at this moment his eyes were gleaming with crazed enthusiasm. "It's part of our new training program. Come on, grab your broom, and let's go," said Wood heartily. "None of the other teams have started training yet. We're going to be the first of the mark this year. Yawning and shivering slightly, Harry climbed out of bed and tried to find his Quidditch robes. "Good man," said Wood. "Meet you on the field in 15 minutes. When he had found his Scarlet Team robes and pulled on his cloak for warmth, Harry scribbled a note to Ron explaining where he'd gone, and went down the spiral staircase to the common room, his Nimbus 2000 on his shoulder. He had just reached the portrait hole when there was a clatter behind him, and Colin Creevey came dashing down the spiral staircase, his karama swinging madly around his neck, and something clutched in his hand. "I heard someone say your name on the stairs, Harry. Look what I've got here. I had it developed. I wanted to show you." Harry looked bemusedly at the photograph Colin was brandishing under his nose. A moving black and white Lockhart was tugging hard on Harry's arm. Harry recognized his own. He was pleased to see that his photographic self was putting up a good fight and refusing to be dragged into view. As Harry watched, Lockhart gave up and slumped, panting against the white edge of the picture. "Will you sign it?" said Colin eagerly. "No," said Harry flatly, glancing around to check the room was really deserted. "Sorry, Colin. In a hurry. Quidditch practice." He climbed through the portrait hole. "Oh, wow, wait for me. I've never seen a Quidditch game before." Colin scrambled through the hole after him. It'll be really boring, Harry said quickly, but Colin ignored him, his face shining with excitement. You were the youngest house player in 100 years, weren't you, Harry? Weren't you? Said Colin, trotting alongside him. You must be brilliant. I've never flown. Is it easy? Is that your own broom? Is that the best one there is? Harry didn't know how to get rid of him. It was like having an extremely talkative shadow. I don't really understand Quidditch, said Colin breathlessly. Is it true that there are 4 balls, and 2 of them fly around trying to knock people off their brooms? Yes, said Harry heavily, resigned to explaining the complicated rules of Quidditch. They're called bludgers. There are 2 beaters on each team who carry clubs to beat the bludgers away from their side. Fred and George Weasley are the Gryffindor beaters. And what are the other 4 balls for? Colin asked, tripping down a couple of stairs because he was gazing open-mouthed at Harry. Well, the quaffle, that's the biggest red one, is the one that scores the goals. 3 chasers on each team throw the quaffle to each other and try to get it through the goalpost on each end of the pitch. There are 3 long poles with hoops on the end. And the 4th ball is the golden snitch, said Harry, and it is very small, very fast, and difficult to catch. But that's why what the Seekers got to do, because a game of Quidditch doesn't end until the snitch has been caught, and whichever team's Seeker gets the snitch earns his team an extra 150 points. And you're the Gryffindor Seeker, aren't you? Said Colin in awe. Yes, said Harry, as they left the castle and started across the dew-drenched grass. And there's the keeper, too. He guards the goalpost, that's it, really. But Colin didn't stop questioning Harry all the way down the sloping lawns to the Quidditch field, and Harry only shook him off when he reached the changing rooms. Colin called after him in a piping voice, I'll go and get a good seat, Harry, and hurried off to the stands. The rest of the Gryffindor team was already in the changing room. Wood was the only person who looked truly awake. Fred and George Weasley were sitting puffy-eyed and tousled-haired next to 4th-year Alicia Spinnet, who seemed to be nodding off against the wall behind her. Her fellow chasers, Katie Bell and Angelina Johnson, were yawning side by side opposite them. There you are, Harry. What kept you? Said Wood briskly. Now, I wanted a quick talk with you all before we actually get onto the field, because I spent this morning devising a whole new training program, which I really think will make all the difference. Wood was holding up a large diagram of a Quidditch field on which there were drawn many lines, arrows, and crosses in different colored inks. He took out his wand, tapped the board, and the arrows began to wiggle over the diagram like caterpillars, as Wood launched into a speech about his new tactics. Fred Weasley's head dropped right onto Alicia Spinnet's shoulder, and he began to snore. The first board took nearly 20 minutes to explain, but there was another board under that, and a third under that one. Harry sank into a stupor as Wood droned on and on. So, said Wood, at long last, jerking Harry from a wistful fantasy about what he could be eating for breakfast at this very moment up at the castle. Is that clear? Any questions? I've got a question, Oliver, said George, who had woken with a start. Why couldn't you have told us all this yesterday when we were awake? Wood wasn't pleased. Now listen here, you lot, he said, glowering at them all. We should have won the Quidditch Cup last year. We're easily the best team, but unfortunately, owing to circumstances beyond our control. Harry shifted guiltily in his seat. He had been unconscious in the hospital wing for the final match of the previous year, meaning that Gryffindor had been a player short and had suffered their worst defeat in 300 years. Wood took a moment to regain control of himself. Their last defeat was clearly torturing him. So this year, we train harder than ever before. Okay, let's go and put our new theories into practice, Wood shouted, seizing his broomstick and leading the way out of the locker rooms. Stiff-legged and still yawning, his team followed. They had been in the locker room so long that the sun was now completely up. Although remnants of mist hung over the grass in the stadium. As Harry walked into the field, he saw Ron and Hermione sitting in the stands. Aren't you finished yet? Called Ron incredulously. Haven't even started, said Harry, looking jealously at the toast and marmalade Ron and Hermione had brought out of the Great Hall. Wood's been teaching us new moves. He mounted the broomstick and kicked off the ground, soaring up into the air. The cool morning air whipped his face, waking him far more effectively than Wood's long talk. It felt wonderful to be back on the Quidditch field. He soared right around the stadium at full speed, racing Fred and George. "What's that funny clicking noise?" called Fred as they hurled around the corner. Harry looked at the stands. Colin was sitting in one of the highest seats, and his camera raised, taking pictures after picture. The sound strangely magnified in the deserted stadium. "Look this way, Harry, this way," he cried shrilly. "Who's that?" said Fred. "No idea," Harry lied, putting on a spurt of speed that took him far away as possible from Colin. "What's going on?" said Wood, frowning as he skimmed through the air towards them. "Why is that first year taking pictures? I don't like it. He could be a Slytherin spy trying to finding out about our new training program." "He's a Gryffindor," said Harry quickly. "And the Slytherins don't need a spy, Oliver," said George. "What makes you say that?" said Wood testily. "Because they're here in person," said George, pointing. Several people in green robes were walking onto the field, broomsticks in hands. "I don't believe it," Wood hissed in outrage. "I booked the field for today. We'll see about this." Wood shot toward the ground, landing rather harder than he meant to in his anger, staggering slightly as he dismounted. Harry, Fred, and George followed. "Flint!" Wood bellowed at the Slytherin captain. "This is our practice time. We got specially. You can clear off now." Marcus Flint was even larger than Wood. He had a look of trollish cunning on his face as he replied, "Plenty of room for all of us, Wood. Angelica, Alicia, and Katie. Angelina." I just renamed a character. I'm so sorry, Angelina. Angelina, Alicia, and Katie had come over too. There were no girls on the Slytherin team, who stood shoulder to shoulder facing the Gryffindors, leering to a man. "But I booked the field," said Wood, positively spitting with rage. "I booked it." "Ah," said Flint, "but I've got a specially signed note from Professor Snape. I, Professor S. Snape, give the Slytherin team permission to practice today at the Quidditch field owing to the need to train their new seeker." "You've got a new seeker?" said Wood, distracted. "Where?" And from behind the 6 large figures before them came a 7th, smaller boy, smirking all over his pale, pointed face. It was Draco Malfoy. "Aren't you Lucius Malfoy's son?" said Fred, looking at Malfoy with dislike. "Funny you should mention Draco's father," said Flint, as the whole Slytherin team smiled still more broadly. "Let me show the generous gift he made to the Slytherin team." All 7 of them held out their broomsticks. 7 highly polished brand new handles and 7 sets of fine gold lettering spelling the words Nimbus 2001 gleamed under the Gryffindor's notes to the early morning sun. "Very latest model, only came on last month," said Flint, carelessly flicking a speck of dust from the end of his own. "I believe it outstrips an old 2000 series by a considerable amount. As for the old clean sweeps," he smiled nastily at Fred and George, who were both clutching clean sweep 5s. "Sweeps the boards with them." None of the Gryffindor team could think of anything to say for a moment. Malfoy was smirking so broadly his cold eyes were reduced to slits. "Oh, look," said Flint. "A field invasion." Ron and Hermione were crossing the grass to see what was going on. "What's happening?" Ron asked Harry. "Why aren't you playing? And what's he doing here?" He was looking at Malfoy, taking in his Slytherin Quidditch robes. "I'm the new Slytherin seeker, Weasley," said Malfoy smugly. "Everyone just been admiring the brooms my father bought our team." Ron gasped, open-mouthed, at the 7 superb broomsticks in front of him. "Good, aren't they?" said Malfoy smoothly. "But perhaps the Gryffindor team will be able to raise some gold and get new brooms, too. You could raffle off those Clean Sweep 5s. I expect a museum would bid for them." The Slytherin team howled with laughter. "At least no one on the Gryffindor team had to buy their way in," said Hermione sharply. "They got in on pure talent." The smug look on Malfoy's face flickered. "No one asked your opinion, you filthy little mudblood," he spat. Harry knew at once that Malfoy had said something really bad, because there was an instant uproar at his words. Flint had a dive in front of Malfoy to stop Fred and George jumping on him. Alicia shrieked, "How dare you!" And Ron plunged his hands into his robes, pulling out his wand and yelling, "You'll pay for that one, Malfoy!" and pointed it furiously under Flint's arm at Malfoy's face. A loud bang echoed around the stadium, and a jet of green light shot out of the wrong end of Ron's wand, hitting him in the stomach and sending him reeling backwards onto the grass. Ron, are you all right?" squealed Hermione. Ron opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he gave an almighty belch, and several slugs dribbled out of his mouth onto his lap. Ugh. The Slytherin team was paralyzed with laughter. Flint was doubled up, hanging onto his new broomstick for support, and Malfoy was on all fours banging the ground with his fists. The Gryffindors were gathered around Ron, who kept belching large, glistening slugs. Nobody seemed to want to touch him. "We better get him to Hagrid's, it's nearest," said Harry to Hermione, who nodded bravely, and the pair of them pulled Ron up by the arms. "What happened, Harry? What happened? Is he ill? But you can cure him, can't you?" Colin had run down from his seat, and now was dancing alongside them as they left the field. Ron gave a huge heave, and more slugs dribbled down his front. "Ooh," said Colin, fascinated, and raising his camera. "Can you hold him still, Harry?" "Get out of the way, Colin," said Harry angrily. He and Hermione supported Ron out of the stadium and across the grounds towards the edge of the forest. "Nearly there, Ron," said Hermione as the gamekeeper's cabin came to the field. "You'll be all right in a minute. Almost there." They were within 20 feet of Hagrid's house when the front door opened, but it wasn't Hagrid who emerged. Gilderoy Lockhart, wearing robes of palest mauve today, came striding out. "Quick, behind here," Harry hissed, dragging Ron behind a nearby bush. Hermione followed, somewhat reluctantly. "It's a simple matter if you know what you're doing," Lockhart was saying loudly to Hagrid. "If you need help, you know where I am. I'll let you have a copy of my book. I'm surprised you haven't got one already. I'll sign one tonight and send it over. Well, goodbye." He strode away towards the castle. I don't like Lockhart. Harry waited until Lockhart was out of sight and then pulled Ron out of the bush and up to Hagrid's front door. They knocked urgently. Hagrid appeared at once, looking very grumpy, but his expression brightened when he saw who it was. "Been wondering when you'd come to see me. Come in. Thought you might have been Professor Lockhart back again." Harry and Hermione supported Ron over the threshold into the one-roomed cabin, which had an enormous bed in one corner and a fire crackling merrily in the other. Hagrid didn't seem perturbed by Ron's slug problem, which Harry hastily explained as he lowered Ron into a chair. "Better out than in," he said cheerfully, plunking a large copper basin in front of him. "Get 'em all up, Ron. I don't think there's anything to do except wait for him to stop," said Hermione anxiously, watching Ron bend over the basin. "That's a difficult curse to work with at the best of times, but with a broken wand." Hagrid was bustling around, making them tea. His boarhound Spangs was slobbering over Harry. "What did Lockhart want with you, Hagrid?" Harry asked, scratching Fang's ears. "Giving me advice on getting Kelpies out of the well," growled Hagrid, moving a half-plucked rooster off his scrub table and setting down a teapot. "Like I don't know, and banging on about some banshee he banished. If one word of it's true, I'll eat my kettle." Why did suddenly he get a southern accent? I'm so sorry. It was most unlike Hagrid to criticize a Hogwarts teacher, and Harry looked at him in surprise. Hermione, however, said in a voice somewhat higher than usual, "I think you're being a bit unfair. Professor Dumbledore obviously thought he was the best man for the job." "He was the only man for the job," said Hagrid, offering them a plate of fudge treacle, which Ron coughed squelchily. While Ron coughed squelchily into his basin. "And I mean only one. Getting very difficult to find anyone for the dark arts job. People aren't too keen to take it on, you see. They're starting to think it's jinx. No one's lasted for a while. So tell me," said Hagrid, jerking his head at Ron, "who was he trying to curse?" Who was he trying to curse? "Malfoy called Hermione something. It must have been really bad because everyone went wild." "It was bad," said Ron hoarsely, emerging over the tabletop, looking pale and sweaty. Malfoy called her a mudblood, Hagrid. Ron dived out of sight again as a fresh wave of slugs made their appearance. Hagrid looked outraged. "He didn't!" he growled at Hermione. "He did," she said, "but I don't know what it means. I could tell it was very rude, of course." "It's about the most insulting thing he could think of," gasped Ron, coming back up. "Mudblood's a really foul name for someone who is muggle-born, you know, non-magical parents. There are some wizards like Malfoy's family who think they're better than everyone else because they're what people call pure blood. He gave a small burp, and a single slug fell into his outstretched hand. He threw into the basin and continued. I mean, the rest of us know it doesn't make any difference at all. Look at Neville Longbottom. He's pure blood, and he can hardly stand a cauldron the right way up. And they haven't invented a spell that our Hermione can't do, said Hagrid proudly, making Hermione go brilliant, a brilliant shade of magenta. It's the disgusting thing to call someone, said Ron, wiping his sweaty brow with a shaky hand. Dirty blood, see? Common blood. It's ridiculous. Most wizards these days are half-blood anyway. If we hadn't married muggles, we'd have died out. He reached and ducked out of sight. Well, I don't blame you for trying to curse him, Ron, said Hagrid loudly over the thuds of more slugs hitting the basin. But maybe it was a good thing your wand backfired. Spec Lucius Malfoy would have come marching up to the school if you'd cursed his son. At least you're not in trouble. Harry would have pointed out that the trouble didn't come worse than having slugs pouring out of your mouth, but he couldn't. Hagrid's treacle fudge had cemented his jaws together. Harry, said Hagrid abruptly, as though struck by a sudden thought, got a bone to pick with you. I heard you've been giving out signed photos. How come I haven't got one? Furious, Harry wrenched his teeth apart. I have not been giving out signed photos, he said haughtily. If Lockhart's been spreading that around. But then he saw that Hagrid was laughing. I'm only joking, he said, patting Harry genially on the back and sending him face first into the table. I knew you hadn't really. I told Lockhart you didn't need to. You're more famous than him without trying. Bet you didn't like that, said Harry, sitting up and rubbing his chin. Don't think he did, said Hagrid, his eyes twinkling. And then I told him that I've never read one of his books, and he decided to go. Trickle fudge, Ron, he's added as Ron reappeared. No thanks, said Ron weakly. Better not risk it. Come on and see what I've been growing. Again, southern accent. What is with this? I've been getting a southern accent for some reason. Is someone close that has a southern accent? I want to know. Hey, said Hagrid as Harry and Hermione finished the last of their tea. It was in the small vegetable patch behind Hagrid's house were a dozen of the largest pumpkins Harry had ever seen. Each was the size of a large boulder. Getting on well, aren't they? Said Hagrid happily. For the Halloween feast. Should be big enough by then. What have you been feeding them? What have you been feeding them? Said Harry. Hagrid looked over his shoulder to check that they were alone. Well, I've been giving them, a bit of help. Harry noticed Hagrid's flowery pink umbrella leaning against the back wall of the cabin. Harry had reason to believe before, now that this umbrella was not at all it looked. In fact, he had the strong impression that Hagrid's old school wand was concealed inside. Hagrid wasn't supposed to be using magic. He had been expelled from Hogwarts in his 3rd year, but Harry had never found out why. Any mention of the matter, and Hagrid would clear his throat loudly and become mysteriously deaf until the subject was changed. An engorgement charm, I suppose, said Hermione, halfway between disapproval and amusement. Well, you've done a good job on them. That's what your little sister said Hagrid, nodding at Ron. Met her just yesterday. Hagrid looked sideways at Harry, his beard twitching. Said she was just looking around the grounds, but I reckon she was hoping she might run into someone else at my house. She winked at Harry. He winked at Harry. If you ask me, she wouldn't say no to a sign. Oh, shut up, said Harry. Ron snorted with laughter, and the ground was sprayed with slugs. Watch it, Hagrid roared, pulling Ron away from his precious pumpkins. It was nearly lunchtime, and as Harry had only had a bit of treacle fudge since dawn, he was keen to be back at school to eat. They said goodbye to Hagrid and walked back up to the castle, Ron hiccoughing occasionally, but only bringing up 2 very small slugs. They had barely set foot on the school entrance hall when a voice rang out. There you are, Potter, Weasley. Professor McGonagall was walking down towards them, looking stern. You both will have detention this evening. What are we doing, Professor? Said Ron, nervously suppressing a burp. You will be polishing the silver in the trophy room with Mr. Filch, said Professor McGonagall. And no magic, Weasley. Elbow grease. Ron gulped. Argus Filch, the caretaker, was loathed by every student in the school. And you, Potter, will be helping Professor Lockhart answer his fan mail, said Professor McGonagall. Oh, no, Professor, can't I go and do the trophy room too? Said Harry desperately. Certainly not, said Professor McGonagall, raising her eyebrow. Professor Lockhart has requested you particularly. 8 o'clock sharp, the both of you. That is going to be torture. Harry and Ron slouched into the Gryffindor into the Great Hall in states of deepest gloom, Hermione behind them wearing, well, you did break school rules sort of expression. Harry didn't enjoy his shepherd pie as much as he thought. Both he and Ron felt they'd got the worst deal. Filch will have me up all night, said Ron heavily. No magic. There must have been 100 cups in that room. I'm no good at muggle cleaning. I'd swap any time, said Harry hollowly. I've had a load of practice with the Dursleys. Answering Lockhart's fan mail, he'll be a nightmare. Saturday afternoon seemed to melt away, and what seemed like no time, it was 5 minutes to 8. And Harry was dragging his feet along to the second floor corridor to Lockhart's office. He gritted his teeth and knocked. The door flew open at once. Lockhart beamed down at him. Ah, here's the scallywag, he said. Come on in. Harry, come on in. Shining brightly on the walls by the light of many candles were countless framed photographs of Lockhart. He had even signed a few of them. Another large pile lay on his desk. You can adjust the envelopes, Lockhart told Harry, as though this was a huge treat. The first one's to Gladys Gudgeon. Bless her, huge fan of mine. The minute snailed by. Harry let Lockhart's voice wash over him, occasionally saying, and right, and yeah. Now and then he caught phrases like, fame is a fickle friend, Harry, or celebrity is as celebrity does. Remember that. The candles burned lower and lower, making the light dance over the many moving faces of Lockhart watching him. Harry moved his aching hand over what felt like the thousandth of the envelope, writing out Veronica Smelfy's address. It must be nearly time to leave, Harry thought miserably. Please let it be nearly time. And then he heard something quite apart from the spitting of the dying candles and Lockhart's prattle about his fans. It was a voice to chill the bone to the marrow, a voice of breathtaking ice-cold venom. Come to me, let me rip you, let me tear you, let me kill you. Harry gave a huge jump and a large lilac blot appeared on Veronica Smelfy's street. What? He said loudly. I know, said Lockhart. 6 solid months at the top of the bestseller list. Broke all records. No, said Harry frantically. That voice. Sorry, said Lockhart, looking puzzled. What voice? That voice that said, didn't you hear it? Lockhart was looking at Harry in high astonishment. What are you talking about, Harry? Perhaps you are getting a little drowsy. Great Scott, look at the time. We've been nearly here for 4 hours. I'd never have believed it. The time's flown, hasn't it? Harry didn't answer. He was straining his ears to hear the voice again, but there was no sound now except for Lockhart telling him he mustn't expect a treat like this every time he got detention. Feeling dazed, Harry left. It was so late that the Gryffindor common room was almost empty. Harry went straight up to the dormitory. Ron wasn't back yet. Harry pulled out his pajamas, got into bed, and waited. Half an hour later, Ron arrived, nursing his right arm and bringing a strong smell of polish into the darkened room. My muscles all seized up, he groaned, sinking on his bed. 14 times he made me buff out that Quidditch cup before he was satisfied, and then I had another slug attack all over the special awards with the service out to the school. Took ages to get that slime off. How was it with Lockhart? Keeping his voice low, so not to wake Neville, Dean, and Seamus, Harry told Ron exactly what he had heard. And Lockhart said he couldn't hear it, said Ron. Harry could see him frowning in the moonlight. Do you think he was lying? But I don't get it. Even someone invisible would have opened the door. I know, said Harry, lying back in his four-poster and staring at the canopy above him. I don't get it either. Chapter 8. The Death Day Party. October arrived, spreading a damp chill over the grounds and into the castle. Madame Pomfrey, the nurse, was kept busy by a sudden spat of colds amongst the staff and students. Her pepper-up potion worked instantly, though it left the drinkers smoking at the ears for several hours afterwards. Ginny Weasley, who had been looking pale, was bullied into taking some by Percy. The steam pouring from under her vivid hair gave the impression that her whole head was on fire. Raindrops the size of bullets thundered on the castle windows for days on end. The lake rose, the flower beds turned into muddy streams, and Hagrid's pumpkins swelled to the size of garden sheds. Oliver Wood's enthusiasm for regular training sessions, however, was not dampened, which is why Harry was to be found late one stormy Saturday afternoon, a few days after Halloween, returning to Gryffindor Tower, drenched to the skin and splattered with mud. Even aside from the rain and wind, it hadn't been a happy practice session. Fred and George, who had been spying on the Slytherin team, had seen for themselves the speed of those new Nimbus 2001s. They reported that the Slytherin team was no more than 7 greenish blurs shooting across the sky like missiles. As Harry squelched along the deserted corridor, he came across somebody who looked just as preoccupied as he was. Nearly Headless Nick, the ghost of Gryffindor Tower, was staring morosely out of the window, muttering under his breath, "Don't fulfill the requirements half an inch, if that. Hello, Nick," said Harry. Hello, said Nearly Headless Nick, starting and looking round. He wore a dashing plumed hat on his long curly head, and a tunic with a ruff which concealed the fact that his neck was almost completely severed. He was pale as smoke, and Harry could see right through him in the dark sky and torrential rain outside. "You look troubled, young Potter," said Nick, folding a transparent letter as he spoke and tucking it inside his doublet. "So do you," said Harry. "Ah," Nearly Headless Nick waved an elegant hand. "A matter of no importance. It's not as though I really wanted to join. Thought I'd apply, but apparently I don't fulfill the requirements." And in spite of his airy tone, there was a look of great bitterness on his face. "But you would think, wouldn't you," he erupted suddenly, pulling the letter out of his pocket, "that getting hit 45 times in the neck with a blunt axe would qualify you to join the Headless Hunt?" "Oh, yes," said Harry, who was obviously supposed to agree. "I mean, nobody wishes more than I do that it had been all quick and clean, my head had come off properly. I mean, it would have saved me a great deal of pain and ridicule. However," Nearly Headless Nick shook his letter open and read furiously, "we can only accept huntsmen whose heads have parted company with their body. You will appreciate that it would be impossible otherwise for members to participate in hunts activities such as horseback, head juggling, and head polo. It is with great regret, therefore, that I must inform you that you do not fulfill our requirements. With great wishes, Sir Patrick Delaney Podmore." Fuming, Nearly Headless Nick stuffed the letter away. "Half an inch of skin and sinew holding my neck on, Harry. Most people would think that's good and beheaded, but oh no, it's not good enough for Sir Properly Decapitated Podmore." Nearly Headless Nick took several deep breaths and then said in a far calmer tone, "So what's bothering you? Anything I can do?" "No," said Harry, "not unless you know where we can get 7 free Nimbus 2001s for a match against The rest of Harry's The rest of Harry's sentence was drowned out by a high-pitched mewling from somewhere near his ankles. He looked down and found himself gazing into a pair of lamp-like yellow eyes. It was Mrs. Norris, the skeletal grey cat, who was used by the caretaker, Argus Filch, as a sort of deputy in his endless battle against students. "You better get out of here, Harry," said Nick quickly. "Filch isn't in a good mood. He's got the flu, and some third years accidentally plastered frog bangs all over the ceiling in Dungeon 5. He's been cleaning all morning, and if he sees you dripping mud all over the place—" "Right," said Harry, backing away from the accusing stare of Mrs. Norris, "but not quickly enough." Drawn to the spot by the mysterious power that seemed to connect him with his foul cat, Argus Filch burst suddenly through a tapestry to Harry's right, wheezing, looking wildly about for the rule breaker. There was a thick tartan scarf bound around his head, and his nose was unusually purple. "Filth!" he shouted, his jowls quivering, his eyes popping alarmingly as he pointed at the muddy puddle he had dripped from Harry's Quidditch ropes. "Mess and muck everywhere! I've had enough of it, I tell you! Follow me, Potter!" So Harry waved a gloomy goodbye to nearly Tessa's Nick, and followed Filch back downstairs, doubling the number of muddy footprints on the floor. Harry had never been inside Filch's office before. It was a place most students avoided. The room was dingy and windowless, lit by a single oil lamp dangling from the low ceiling. A faint smell of fried fish lingered about the place. Wooden filing cabinets stood around the walls. From their labels, Harry could see that they contained details of every people Filch had ever punished. Fred and George Weasley had an entire drawer to themselves. A highly polished collection of chains and manacles hung on the wall behind Filch's desk. It was common knowledge that he was always begging Dumbledore to let him suspend students by their ankles from the ceiling. Filch grabbed a quill from a pot on his desk and began shuffling around looking for parchment. Dung, he muttered furiously. Great ceiling dragging bogies, frog brains, rat intestines. I've had enough of it. Make an example. Where's the form? Yes. He retrieved a large roll of parchment from his desk drawer and stretched out in front of him, dipping his long black quill into the ink pot. Name, Harry Potter. Crime. It was only a bit of mud, said Harry. It was only a bit of mud to you, boy, but to me it's an extra hour of scrubbing, shouted Filch, a drip shivering unpleasantly at the end of his bulbous nose. Crime, befouling the castle. Suggested sentence. Dabbing at his streaming nose, Filch squinted unpleasantly at Harry, who waited with bated breath for his sentence to fall. But as Filch lowered his quill, there was a great bang on the ceiling of the office, which made the oil lamp rattle. Peeves! Filch roared, flinging down his quill in a transport of rage. I'll have you this time, I'll have you! And without a backward glance at Harry, Filch ran flat-footed from the office, Mrs. Norris streaking alongside him. Peeves was a school poltergeist, a grinning airborne menace who lived to cause havoc and distress. Harry didn't much like Peeves, but he couldn't help feeling grateful for his timing. Hopefully, whatever Peeves had done, and it sounded as though he'd wrecked something very big this time, would distract Filch from Harry. Thinking that he should probably wait for Filch to come back, Harry sank into a moth-eaten chair next to the desk. There was only one thing on it apart from his half-completed form, a large, glossy purple envelope with silver lettering on the front. With a quick glance at the door to check that Filch wasn't on his way, Harry picked up the envelope and read, Quick Spell, a correspondence course in beginner's magic. Intrigued, Harry flicked the envelope open and pulled out a sheaf of parchment inside. More curly silver writing on the front page said, Feel out of step in the modern world of modern magic? Find yourself making excuses not to perform simple spells? Ever been taunted for your woeful wand work? There is an answer. Quick Spell is an all-new, fail-safe, quick result, easy-learn course. Hundreds of witches and wizards have benefited from the Quick Spell method. Madame Z. Nettles of Topsham writes, I had no memory for incantations, and my potions were a family joke. Now, after Quick Spell course, I am the center of attention at parties, and friends beg for my recipe of my scintillation solution. Warlock D.J. Prod of Dinsbury said, My wife used to sneer at my feeble charms, but 1 month into your fabulous Quick Spell course, and I succeeded in turning her into a yak. Thank you, Quick Spell. Fascinated, Harry thumbed through the rest of the envelope contents. Why on earth did Filch want a Quick Spell course? Did this mean he wasn't a proper wizard? Harry was just reading Lesson 1, Holding Your Wand, some useful tips. When shuffling footsteps outside told him Filch was coming back. Stuffing the parchment back into the envelope, Harry threw it back onto the desk as the door opened. Filch was triumphant. The vanishing cabinet was extremely valuable. He was saying gleefully to Mrs. Norris, We'll have peace on this one, my sweet. His eyes fell on Harry, then darted to the Quick Spell envelope, which, Harry realized too late, was lying 2 feet away from where it had started. Filch's pasty face went brick red. Harry braced himself for a tidal wave of fury. Filch hobbled across the room, snatched up the envelope, and threw it into the drawer. Did you read? He sputtered. No, Harry lied quickly. Filch's knobbly hands were twisting together. If I thought you'd read my private... Not that's mine for a friend, but be that as it may, however, Harry was staring at him, alarmed. Filch had never looked madder. His eyes were popping, a tick was going in one of his pouchy cheeks, and the tartan scarf didn't help. Very well, go and don't breathe a word. Not that, however, if you didn't read, go on, I have to write up Peeves' report. Go! Amazed at his luck, Harry sped out of the office, up the corridor, and back upstairs. To escape from Filch's office without punishment was some kind of school record. Harry, did it work? Nearly Headless Nick came gliding out of the classroom. Behind him, Harry could see the wreckage of a large black and gold cabinet that appeared to have been dropped from a great height. It persuaded Peeves to crush it right over Filch's office, said Nick eagerly. Thought it might distract him. Was that you? Said Harry gratefully. Yeah, it worked. I didn't even get detention. Thanks, Nick. Was that you? They set off the corridor together. Nearly Headless Nick, Harry noticed, was still holding Sir Patrick's rejection letter. I wish there was something I could do for you about the Headless Hunt, Harry said. Nearly Headless Nick stopped in his tracks and walked right through him. He wished he hadn't. And Harry walked right through him. Harry wished he hadn't. It was like stepping through an icy shower. But there is something you could do for me, said Nick excitedly. Harry, would I be asking too much? But no, you wouldn't want... What is it? Said Harry. Well, this Halloween will be my 500th death day, said Nearly Headless Nick, drawing himself up and looking dignified. Oh, said Harry, not sure whether he should be sorry or happy about this. Right. I'm holding a party down in one of the roomier dungeons. Friends will be coming from all over the country. It'd be such an honor if you would attend. Mr. Weasley and Miss Granger would be most welcome too, of course, but I dare say you'd rather go to the school feast. He watched Harry on tenterhooks. No, said Harry quickly. I'll come. My dear boy, Harry Potter, at my death day party, and he hesitated, looking excitedly. Do you think you could possibly mention to Sir Patrick how very frightening and impressive you find me? Of course, said Harry. Nearly Headless Nick beamed at him. A death day party, said Hermione keenly when Harry had changed at last and joined her and Ron in the common room. I bet there aren't many living people who can say they've been to one of those. It'll be fascinating. Why would anyone want to celebrate the day they died? Said Ron, who was halfway through his potions homework and grumpy. Sounds dead depressing to me. I mean, I guess you can consider it as a second birthday, considering. I'm just saying. Rain was still lashing the windows, which were now inky black, but inside all looked bright and cheerful. The firelight glowed over the countless squashy armchairs where people sat reading, talking, doing homework, or, in the case of Fred and George Weasley, trying to find out what would happen if you fed a filibuster firework to a salamander. Fred had rescued the brilliant orange fire-dwelling lizard from the care of magical creatures class, and it was now smoldering gently on the table, surrounded by a knot of curious people. Harry was at the point of telling Ron and Hermione about Filch and the Quickspell course when the salamander suddenly whizzed into the air, emitting loud sparks and bangs as it whirled wildly around the room. Fred and George, why do you do this? The sight of Percy bellowing himself hoarse at Fred and George, the spectacular display of tangerine stars showering from the salamander's mouth, and escape into the fire with accompanying explosions, drove both Filch and the Quickspell envelope from Harry's mind. By the time Halloween arrived, Harry was regretting his rash promise to go to the Death Day party. The rest of the school was happily anticipating their Halloween feast. The Great Hall had been decorated with the usual live bats. Hagrid's vast pumpkins had been carved into lanterns large enough for 3 men to sit in, and there were rumors that Dumbledore had booked a troupe of dancing skeletons for the entertainment. A promise is a promise, Hermione reminded Harry bossily. You said you'd go to his Death Day party. So at 7 o'clock, Harry, Ron, and Hermione walked straight past the doorway to the packed Great Hall, which was glittering invitingly with gold plates and candles, and directed their steps instead towards the dungeon. The passageway leading to Nearly Headless Nick's party had been lined with candles too. Though the effect was very far from cheerful. These were long. Give me a sec. Alright, let's try that again. The passageway leading to Nearly Headless Nick's party had been lined with candles, too, though the effect was far from beyond cheerful. These were long, thin, jet-black tapers, all burning bright blue, casting a dim, ghostly light even over their own living faces. The temperature dropped with every step they took. As Harry shivered and drew his robes tightly around him, he heard what sounded like 1,000 fingernails scraping an enormous blackboard. Is that supposed to be music? Ron whispered. They turned a corner and saw a nearly headless Nick standing at the doorway, hung with black velvet drapes. My dear friends, he said mournfully, welcome, welcome, so please you could come. He swept off his plumed hat and bowed them inside. It was an incredible sight. The dungeon was full of hundreds of pearly white, translucent people, most drifting around a crowded dance floor, waltzing to the dreadful, quavering sound of 30 musical saws played by an orchestra on a raised, black-draped platform. A chandelier overhead blazed midnight blue with 1,000 more black candles. Their breath rose in mist before them. It was like stepping into a freezer. Shall we have a look around? Harry suggested, wanting to warm up his feet. Careful not to walk through anyone, said Ron nervously, and they set off around the edge of the dance floor. They passed a group of gloomy nuns, a ragged man wearing chains, the fat friar, the cheerful Hufflepuff ghost, who was talking to a knight with an arrow sticking from his forehead. Harry wasn't surprised to see that the Bloody Baron, a gaunt, staring Slytherin ghost covered in silver bloodstains, was being given a wide berth by the rest of the ghosts. Oh no, said Hermione, stopping abruptly. Turn back, I don't want to talk to Moaning Myrtle. Who? Said Harry, as they backtracked quickly. The ghost that will have a massive crush on Harry Potter. Who? Said Harry, as they backtracked quickly. She haunts one of the toilets in the girls' bathroom on the first floor, said Hermione. She haunts a toilet? Yes, it's been out of order all year because she keeps having tantrums and flooding the place. I never went in there anyway, if I could avoid it. It's awful trying to have a pee with her wailing at you. Look, food, said Ron. On the other side of the dungeon was a long table, also covered in black velvet. They approached eagerly, but next moment had stopped in their tracks, horrified. The smell was quite disgusting. Large rotten fish was laid on the handsome silver platters. Cakes burned charcoal black were heaped on salves. There was a great maggoty haggis, a slab of cheese covered in furry green mold, and a pride of place, an enormous grey cake in the shape of a tombstone, with tar-like icing forming the words, Sir Nimsy de Mimsy Porpington, died 31st October, 1492. Harry watched amazed as a portly ghost approached the table, crouched low, and walked through it, his mouth held wide open so that it passed through one of the stinking salmons. Can you taste it if you walk through it? Harry asked him. Almost, said the ghost sadly as he drifted away. I expect they've let it rot to give it stronger flavor, said Hermione knowledgeably, pinching her nose and leaning closer at the putrid haggis. Can we move? I feel sick, said Ron. They had barely turned around, however, when a little man swooped suddenly from under the table and came to a halt in midair before them. Hello, Peeves, said Harry cautiously. Unlike the ghosts around him, Peeves the poltergeist was very reverse of pale and transparent. He was wearing a bright orange party hat, a revolving bow tie, and a broad grin on his face, wide, wicked face. Nibbles? He said sweetly, offering them a bowl of peanuts covered in fungus. No thanks, said Hermione. Heard you talking about poor Myrtle, said Peeves, his eyes dancing. Rude you were about poor Myrtle. He took a deep breath and bellowed, Oi, Myrtle! Oh no, Peeves, don't tell her what I said. She'll be really upset. Hermione whispered frantically. I didn't mean it. I don't mind her. Hello, Myrtle. The squat ghost of a girl had glided over. She had a glummer face Harry had ever seen, half hidden behind lank hair and thick, pearly spectacles. What? She said sulkily. How are you, Myrtle? Said Hermione in a falsely bright voice. It's nice to see you out of the toilet. Myrtle sniffed. Miss Granger was just talking about you, said Peeves slyly in Myrtle's ear. Just saying how nice you look tonight, said Hermione, glaring at Peeves. Myrtle eyed Hermione suspiciously. You're making fun of me, she said, silver tears welling rapidly in her small, see-through eyes. No, honestly, didn't I say how nice Myrtle was looking? Said Hermione, nudging Harry and Ron painfully in the ribs. Oh, yeah, she did. Don't lie to me, Myrtle gasped, tears now flooding down her face, while Peeves chuckled happily over his shoulder. Do you think I don't know what people call me behind my back? Fat Myrtle, ugly Myrtle, miserable, moaning, moping Myrtle. You forgot Pimply, Peeves hissed in her ear. Moaning Myrtle burst into anguished sobs and fled from the dungeon. Peeves shot after her, pelting her with moldy peanuts, yelling, Pimply, Pimply! Oh dear, said Hermione sadly. Nearly Headless Nick now drifted towards them through the crowd. I wanted to say something real quick. That whole scene, the body's dad called the past host basically the original. It's hard to explain, but they called Zoe. He called Zoe Myrtle. He would say "Oi Myrtle" whenever he wanted her attention. So just thought that was interesting. I guess I don't know. It's weird. Enjoying yourselves? Oh yes, they lied. Not a bad turnout, said Nearly Headless Nick proudly. The wailing widow came all the way from Kent, and it's nearly time for my speech. I better go and warn the orchestra. The orchestra, however, stopped playing at the very moment. They and everyone in the dungeon fell silent, looking around in excitement as a hunting horn sounded. Oh, here we go, said Nearly Headless Nick bitterly. Through the dungeon wall burst a dozen ghost horses, each ridden by headless horsemen. The assembly clapped wildly. Harry started to clap too, but stopped quickly at the sight of Nick's face. The horses galloped into the middle of the dance floor and halted, rearing and plunging. At the front of the pack was a large ghost who held his bearded head under his arm, from which position he was blowing the horn. The ghost leapt down, lifted his head high in the air so he could see around the crowd. Everyone laughed, and strode over to Nearly Headless Nick, squashing his head back onto his neck. Nick, he roared, how are you? Head still hanging in there? He gave a hearty guffaw and clapped Nearly Headless Nick on the shoulder. Welcome, Patrick, said Nick stiffly. Livins! He said, Sir Patrick spotting Harry, Ron, and Hermione, and giving a huge fake jump of astonishment so that his head fell off again. The crowd howled with laughter. Very amusing, said Nearly Headless Nick darkly. Don't mind, Nick, shouted Sir Patrick's head from the floor. Still upset we won't let him join the hunt, but I mean to say, look at the fellow. I think, said Harry hurriedly at a meaningful look from Nick. Nick's very frightening and Ha! Yelled Sir Patrick's head. Bet he asked you to say that. If I could have everyone's attention, it's time for my speech, said Nearly Headless Nick loudly, shredding toward the podium and climbing into an icy blue spotlight. My late lamented lords, ladies, and gentlemen, it is my great sorrow, but nobody heard much more. Sir Patrick and the rest of the Headless Stunt had started a game of head hockey, and the crowd was turning to watch. Nearly Headless Nick tried vainly to recapture his audience, but gave up as Sir Patrick's head went sailing right past him to loud cheers. Harry is very cold now, not to mention hungry. I can't stand much more of this, Ron muttered, his teeth chattering as the orchestra ground back into action, and the ghosts swept back onto the dance floor. Let's go, Harry agreed. They backed toward the door, nodding and beaming at everyone who looked at them, and a minute later was hurrying back up the passageway full of black candles. Pudding might not be finished yet, said Ron hopefully, leading the way towards the steps of the entrance hall. And then Harry heard it. Rip. Tear! Kill! It was the same voice, same cold, murderous voice he had heard in Lockhart's office. It was the same cold, murderous voice he had heard in Lockhart's office. He stumbled to a halt, clutching at the stone wall, listening with all his might, looking around, squinting up and down the dimly lit passageway. Harry, what are you? It's the voice again. Shut up a minute. So hungry. For so long. Listen, said Harry urgently, and Ron and Hermione froze, watching him. Kill! Time to kill! The voice was growing fainter. Harry was sure it was moving away, moving upwards. A mixture of fear and excitement gripped him as he stared at the dark ceiling. How could it be moving upwards? Was it a phantom to whom stone ceilings didn't matter? This way, he shouted, and he began to run up the stairs into the entrance hall. It was no good hoping to hear anything here. The babble of talk from the Halloween feast was echoing of the great hall. Harry sprinted up the marble staircase to the first floor, Ron and Hermione clattering behind him. Harry, what are we— Shh! Harry strained his ears distantly from the floor above. Growing fainter still, he heard, I smell blood! I smell blood! His stomach lurched. It's going to kill somebody, he shouted, and ignoring Ron and Hermione's bewildered faces, he ran up the next flight of steps, 3 at a time, trying to listen over his own pounding footsteps. Harry hurtled around the whole of the second floor, Ron and Hermione panting behind him, not stopping until they turned a corner into the last deserted passageway. Harry, what was that about? Said Ron, wiping sweat off his face. I couldn't hear anything. But Hermione gave a sudden... Sorry, hiccups. But Hermione gave a sudden gasp, pointing down the corridor. Look! Something was shining on the wall ahead. They approached, slowly squinting through the darkness. Foot-high words had been dabbed on the wall between two windows, shimmering in the light cast by flaming torches. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware. What's that thing hanging underneath? Said Ron, a slight quiver in his voice. As they edged nearer, Harry almost slipped. There was a large puddle of water on the floor. Ron and Hermione grabbed him, and they inched toward the message, eyes fixed on the dark shadow beneath it. All three of them realized what it was at once, leapt back with a splash. Mrs. Norris, the caretaker's cat, was hanging by her tail from the carriage bracket. She was stiff as a board, her eyes wide and staring. For a few seconds they didn't move. Then Ron said, "Let's get out of here. Shouldn't we try and help?" Harry began awkwardly. "Trust me," said Ron. "We don't want to be found here." But it was too late. A rumble as large as the distant thunder told them that the feast had just ended. From either end of the corridor where they stood came the loud sounds of hundreds of feet climbing the stairs, and loud, happy talk of well-fed people. Next moment, students were crashing into the passage from both ends. The chatter, the bustle, the noise died suddenly, as the people from front spotted the hanging cat. Harry, Ron, and Hermione stood alone in the middle of the corridor as silence fell among the mass of students passing forward to see the grisly sight. Then someone shouted through the quiet, "Enemies of the air, beware! You'll be next, mudbloods!" It was Draco Malfoy, who had pushed to the front of the crowd, his cold eyes alive, his usually bloodless face flushed as he grinned at the sight of the hanging, immobile cat. Alright, thank you for listening to this episode of the Chamber of Secrets. I hope to see you again next time. There are links down below that are important, so just go check it down. Our Wattpad, our Twitter, everything. And there's also GoFundMe that's important, so please check that out. Thank you for watching and have a nice night. Thank you.